In a small, peaceful town, life typically moved at a slow pace. People knew each other's names and there was a sense of safety in the air. However, like in many towns, things were not always as perfect as they seemed. Beneath the calm exterior, there were stories of tension and hidden struggles, one of which would unfold on a warm evening in late spring. A young police officer, just a few years into his job, had earned a reputation for being overly aggressive. He didn't think much about his actions as long as he believed he was keeping the streets safe. But there was something about him that caused others to question his methods. He was quick to judge, especially when it came to people he considered out of place. It wasn't unusual for him to make snap decisions, acting on assumptions rather than facts. Unfortunately, this attitude would lead him down a dangerous path that night. It all began when he was driving his patrol car, looking for anything suspicious. He'd been on the force long enough to know that the town, while quiet, wasn't free of crime. His eyes scanned the street, passing families walking home, teenagers hanging out near the park, and the usual cars parked along the road. Then, something caught his attention. A sleek, dark-colored sedan was parked along the curb. It was an expensive car, too expensive for a place like this, in his opinion. The officer's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure why, but something about the car didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the fact that it didn't belong to any of the usual townspeople he recognized, or maybe it was just the way it stood out, parked alone on an otherwise quiet street. He slowed down and made a quick turn, pulling up alongside the car. The officer's instincts told him that something wasn't right. He didn't stop to think about whether there could be a reasonable explanation for a car being parked on the side of the road. Instead, he felt the need to act, to confront whatever threat he believed was hiding there. The officer got out of his patrol car, his boots making a sharp sound against the pavement. He walked towards the vehicle, his eyes scanning every detail of the car from the shiny rims to the tinted windows. He tapped the door with his baton, as if to see if anyone was inside. The street was still quiet with no one else in sight. It felt like he was the only one awake in the town. At this point, the officer's mind was already made up. He didn't need any more evidence to justify his actions. Something about this car screamed trouble. He was convinced that it was either abandoned or being used for some shady purpose. Without hesitation, he reached for his baton and began smashing the car's windows. The sound of glass breaking echoed in the quiet night air. The officer's face tightened as he struck again, convinced that he was doing the right thing. He didn't even notice the small group of people who had started to gather a few houses down, having heard the commotion. All he cared about was getting to the bottom of what he believed was a criminal act. What the officer didn't know was that this car wasn't just any car. It belonged to someone important. A 3-star Army general, someone who had served the country with distinction for decades, had been out of town for a few days. The general had parked the car there near a small diner, while he took care of some business in a neighboring city. The car was nothing more than a vehicle to the officer, but to the general it was a symbol of his achievements, his pride, and his hard work. It was also a reminder of his ties to the community, a community that held him in high regard. The general, a man who had seen far more dangerous situations than this, was miles away when the officer began his attack on the car. He had no idea what was happening in his quiet hometown. Meanwhile, the officer continued to strike the windows, enjoying the power he felt as he destroyed something valuable. His reasoning was simple. If someone had broken the law, they deserved to be punished. No questions asked. It didn't matter that the car was parked legally. In his mind, the situation was clear. This car represented something suspicious, and he needed to do something about it. It was only when the general's aide, who had been keeping track of the general's car, received a phone call that things began to shift. The aide had just spoken to the general moments before and was on his way to check on the car. When he heard about the destruction happening, he immediately contacted the general, his heart racing with concern. The general's reaction was immediate. He was furious. The general had built his career on discipline and respect, and he had never been someone who took matters like this lightly. But there was more to this than just a destroyed car. It was the principle of the matter. It was the officer's complete disregard for the rule of law, his judgment clouded by bias. It wasn't just a car. It was an act of injustice that could not go unanswered. The general instructed his aide to track down the officer's location. He wasn't going to let this slide. He needed to find out who was behind this and make sure it didn't happen again. Meanwhile, the officer, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him, stepped back from the car. He was breathing heavily, his adrenaline still running high. He surveyed the damage, windows shattered, glass scattered across the street. There was something almost satisfying about it, as though he had done something heroic. He thought to himself that he had saved the town from a hidden threat, that he had done his duty. But just as the officer began to walk away from the scene, a voice called out to him from behind. It was a man who had been watching from a distance, someone who had witnessed the entire event unfold. The man was calm, but there was urgency in his voice. He wasn't just an ordinary civilian. He was someone who had seen enough in his time to know that what was happening here wasn't just a simple case of a misjudgment. "Hey," the man shouted, his voice rising above the officer's thoughts. "That's the general's car." The officer stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face the man. There was a moment of silence before the officer spoke, his voice defensive. "What are you talking about?" he said. "This car was abandoned." It was suspicious. The man shook his head, stepping forward. "No, that's the general's car. You don't know who you're messing with." The officer's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the civilian pulled out his phone and called the general's office. The officer could only stand there, his hands trembling slightly. The man spoke quickly on the phone, giving details about the situation. The officer's heart began to race, realization starting to creep in. What had he done? As the phone call ended, the civilian looked at the officer with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You've made a huge mistake," the man said, shaking his head. "The general won't let this go." The officer's stomach sank. The reality of his actions started to hit him. What had begun as a simple, unjustified act of vandalism was about to turn into something much bigger, something he could never have predicted. The officer stood there, frozen for a moment as the man on the phone finished speaking. The conversation was brief, but the officer felt every second tick by like an eternity. He had never expected his night to take such a turn. His mind raced as the implications of his actions began to settle in. The thought of destroying someone's property didn't seem so simple anymore. The man with the phone gave the officer one last glance, shaking his head in disbelief. "You better pray the general isn't already on his way." The officer's pulse quickened. He had no idea who the general was at first. All he knew was that the car, in his eyes, was abandoned, and that justified his decision. Now, however, he was beginning to realize that the situation was far more complicated. He had just destroyed something much more than a car. He had destroyed someone's pride, someone who wasn't just another resident of the town. The civilian walked away, muttering under his breath, leaving the officer standing there in the middle of the street. It wasn't just the damage to the car that worried him now. It was the fact that he had done it with such a lack of consideration. If the general had indeed arrived, there was no telling how this situation might unfold. The officer had seen enough bad situations in his brief career to know that what he had done could cost him more than just a reprimand. He turned back to the car, the shattered windows now glaring back at him. His stomach twisted. The moonlight caught the shards of glass scattered on the road, casting reflections that seemed to mock him. He bent down slowly to pick up a piece, running his fingers over the jagged edge. It felt sharp, like the truth that was now sinking in. He hadn't just acted out of instinct. He had acted out of prejudice. There was no other way to explain it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up behind him. He turned sharply, his heart racing. Was it the general? Had he already arrived? The officer could barely bring himself to look. In the dim light, he could make out the shape of a black car, sleek and polished, pulling up to the curb just a few feet away. The door swung open and a tall man stepped out. The general. It was him. The officer stood still as the man walked toward him. His steps were slow but deliberate, a man who carried with him both authority and experience. The officer could feel the weight of the general's gaze even before he saw his face clearly. His stomach churned as he realized the mistake he had made, and he wondered if he would ever be able to explain himself. The general didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at the officer and then at the broken car. His face remained calm, but there was an air of quiet anger that made the officer uneasy. It was clear that the general didn't need to say much to convey his feelings. The scene before them spoke volumes. After a long pause, the general's voice broke through the silence. "You destroyed my car," he said, his words measured and steady. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A simple, undeniable truth. The officer felt a knot tighten in his throat, his mouth going dry. I thought it was abandoned," the officer stammered, fumbling for an explanation. "It was parked in a suspicious spot and—" The general interrupted him, his tone cold but controlled. "You thought it was abandoned? Did you even check to see if someone was inside? Or did you just decide to destroy my property without a second thought?" The officer's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't checked. He had acted purely on assumption. The general's words cut deep, and he could feel his face flush with embarrassment. The realization of what he had done was beginning to hit harder than the panic he had felt earlier. I didn't mean to." The officer trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. His mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but he knew it was futile. There was no excuse for what he had done. The general had every right to be angry, and the officer was in no position to defend himself. The general stood for a moment, staring at the officer, as if he were measuring him. The officer held his breath, wondering if the general would shout, demand answers, or even retaliate in some way. But instead, the general's face softened slightly, and he spoke again, this time with a hint of disappointment in his voice. "You're a police officer," he said, his tone carrying both authority and a touch of sadness. "You should know better than to act on assumptions. People look to you for protection, not for recklessness. You've got a responsibility, not just to uphold the law, but to treat everyone with respect." The officer wanted to argue, to explain that he had acted in good faith, but the words stuck in his throat. The general was right. It wasn't just about the car. It was about how the officer had handled the situation. His own bias had clouded his judgment, and now there was no turning back. "I'm sorry," the officer muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know what else to say. The apology felt inadequate, like it wouldn't be enough to fix the damage he had caused. The general's eyes softened further, but there was still an edge to his words. "Sorry doesn't fix this. You can't just walk away from something like this. Not when you've made a mistake this big." The officer nodded, feeling the weight of the general's words. He knew the general was right. Sorry wasn't enough. He had violated the trust of not just a community member, but someone who had served this country, someone who had earned his place of respect. "I'll make this right," the officer said, his voice firming up slightly. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer in that moment. He knew that the damage to the car could be fixed, but the trust he had lost, well, that was something far harder to repair. The general gave a slight nod, as if he were evaluating the officer's sincerity. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I hope so, but I'm not the one you need to prove it to." The officer frowned, not fully understanding the general's meaning. "You need to prove it to yourself," the general continued, his voice softer now. "You need to learn to look beyond your assumptions, to see people for who they truly are, not what you think they are. That's the only way you'll ever be the officer this town deserves." The officer swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling in his chest. He hadn't just violated the general's trust. He had betrayed the very essence of what it meant to be a police officer. He had let prejudice and rash judgment guide his actions, and now he had to face the consequences. But in that moment, as he stood before the general, there was also something else, the realization that this was a turning point. He couldn't change what had already happened, but he could change what came next, and that perhaps was the most important lesson of all. The general, seeing the officer's internal struggle, sighed deeply. "I'm not going to press charges, but this will be dealt with one way or another. I hope you understand that." The officer nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. "I do. I'll take full responsibility." The general gave him a final, searching look before turning to leave. As he got into his car, he glanced back one last time, his face unreadable. "Good luck," he said, his voice low but not unkind. The officer stood there for a moment, watching the general drive away. He knew that his journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had a long road ahead of him, filled with lessons that would be far harder to learn than any book could teach him. But for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the car. It was about becoming the kind of officer he had promised to be. The kind who served with fairness, integrity, and respect for every person, no matter who they were. The following days were a blur for the officer. He couldn't shake the events that had unfolded so suddenly, and the weight of his actions felt heavier with each passing moment. What had started as a routine night of patrol had turned into a personal reckoning. The general's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't ignore the truth behind them. The officer had spent his entire career focused on following orders, on enforcing rules. But this incident had shown him something far more important. He had lost sight of what it truly meant to be a protector of the community. As the officer tried to go back to his normal duties, everything felt different. The streets, once familiar, now seemed filled with eyes that were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't even bring himself to look at his patrol car without thinking of the generals. It wasn't just the damage to the car that gnawed at him, it was the fact that he had acted out of instinct and prejudice instead of following his training. He had let a moment of impulse define him, and now he had to live with the consequences. Days turned into weeks, and while the officer tried to go about his business, the sense of guilt weighed on him. He had tried to apologize, but the general had been clear. An apology was not enough. The officer needed to prove he was capable of change, to show that he understood the deeper meaning behind his mistake. That was easier said than done. The more he tried to reflect on the general's words, the harder it became to see where he had gone wrong. He had always thought of himself as someone who followed the law, but now, he wasn't sure if that was enough. What good was following the law if it didn't come with understanding, compassion, and fairness? The officer found himself spending more time questioning his motives. Why had he assumed the car was abandoned? Why had he jumped to conclusions without giving anyone the benefit of the doubt? It was easy to dismiss his actions as a mistake, a moment of poor judgment, but deep down the officer knew it was more than that. It was his bias, his ingrained beliefs about certain people, that had clouded his reasoning. It was a hard truth to face, but it was the only way forward. The next step in the officer's journey came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, as he was working on a routine patrol, he received an unexpected call. The dispatcher informed him that the general had requested to speak with him. The officer's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from the general again. He thought that after their encounter the matter was closed. But now it seemed that the general had more to say. The officer arrived at the general's office the next day, feeling a sense of nervous anticipation. The door was already open when he arrived, and the general was sitting behind a large desk. He was dressed in his military uniform, his posture as straight as ever, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as the officer stepped inside. The general didn't look up immediately, but motioned for the officer to take a seat. The officer sat across from him, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. He wasn't sure what to expect. The general had already made it clear that he was holding him accountable, but now it seemed like there was something more the general wanted to say. After a long silence, the general finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began, his voice calm and steady, "and I've come to a conclusion. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that you need to address." The officer swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I know," he replied quietly. "I've been thinking about it every day since it happened. I made a horrible mistake, and I don't know how to make up for it." The general looked at him with a mixture of seriousness and understanding. "You're not the first person to make a mistake," he said. "But not everyone is willing to learn from it. That's where you have a choice. You can either let this define you, or you can use it as a lesson." The officer looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say. He knew the general was right. This was his chance to prove that he wasn't just some officer who had let his prejudices rule his actions. He could do better, he just needed to figure out how. The general continued. "I've been working with the department to implement new training programs. Programs that focus on understanding, on recognizing bias, and on truly serving the community. We're going to teach officers how to listen to people, not just enforce the law. It's time to make real change, and you're going to be a part of it." The officer's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected anything like this. He had assumed the general would want him reprimanded or even removed from duty. But this was an opportunity for growth. The general was giving him a chance to turn things around, not just for himself, but for the entire department. "I don't deserve this chance," the officer said, his voice full of regret. "I've let my community down." The general's expression softened slightly. "You do deserve it. But it's not about what you deserve. It's about what you're willing to do with it. You've been given a chance to make a difference, to show that you can learn and change. If you don't take it, then that's on you. The officer nodded, his mind racing. This was more than just a second chance. It was an opportunity to rebuild his career, to rebuild his reputation, and to prove that he could be the officer that everyone needed him to be. But it wouldn't be easy. It would require him to confront his biases head-on and challenge everything he had once believed. For the next few weeks, the officer threw himself into the new training programs. It wasn't easy at first. Every day he had to push himself to break down the walls he had built around his beliefs. He had grown up in a world where certain assumptions were made about people, where judgments were passed without thought. It wasn't that he had wanted to be this way. It was just the environment he had grown up in. But now, with the general's guidance and the support of his colleagues, he was learning how to see the world through a different lens. There were moments of discomfort. He found himself questioning everything he had been taught, every action he had taken. But there were also moments of clarity. Slowly but surely, he began to understand that it wasn't about being right. It was about being fair. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about treating people with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. By the end of the program, the officer felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was someone who truly understood what it meant to serve his community. He had learned that the job wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about building trust, creating relationships, and making people feel safe. One day, a few months after the incident with the car, the officer was on his usual patrol when he saw a familiar face. It was the civilian who had witnessed the destruction of the general's car. The man looked at him with a cautious glance, as if waiting for some sort of apology or explanation. The officer took a deep breath and approached him. "I owe you an apology," the officer said, his voice sincere. "I wasn't thinking clearly that night. I let my assumptions take over, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I've been working on myself, trying to be a better officer. I hope you can see that." The man looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I can see it. You've changed. That's all anyone can ask for." As the officer continued on his patrol, he realized that the journey wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more lessons to learn. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. Not as someone who acted out of fear or prejudice, but as someone who was ready to listen, to understand, and to make a difference. The officer had come a long way since the night he had destroyed the general's car. The road had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and discomfort, but it had also been full of growth. He had learned to confront his biases, challenge his assumptions, and become more aware of the ways he interacted with others. His relationship with the community, the department, and even himself had changed. But just as he felt like he was finding his place, a new challenge emerged, one that would test everything he had worked for. It happened on a quiet morning, a day that started like any other. The officer was on his usual patrol route, driving through the streets that he had come to know well. As he passed a small park, something unusual caught his eye. A group of teenagers was gathered in a circle, their voices raised in excitement. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough, but as the officer slowed down to get a better look, he noticed that there was something off. The teenagers were standing around a man who appeared to be on the ground, struggling to get up. The officer's instincts kicked in. He pulled over to the side of the road and got out of his car, walking toward the scene. The group of teenagers hadn't noticed him yet, and the officer took a moment to assess the situation. The man on the ground was older, his clothes tattered, and there was a look of distress on his face. The officer could hear snippets of the conversation as he approached, the teenagers laughing and jeering. It was clear that they weren't trying to help the man, they were taunting him. "Hey," the officer called out, his voice firm as he stepped forward. The teenagers immediately stopped and turned to face him, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty. "What's going on here?" The teens shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a tall boy with a baseball cap, spoke up. "We're just messing around with him, man. He's fine. Don't worry about it." The officer didn't buy it. He crouched down beside the man on the ground who was struggling to sit up. "Are you okay?" the officer asked gently, his tone much softer now. The man looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. Please help me," he muttered, his voice trembling. It was clear that he wasn't in good shape, and the officer's heart went out to him. The officer turned back to the teenagers. "What did you do to him?" he demanded. One of the other teens, a girl with short hair and a defiant look on her face, stepped forward. "He's just a homeless guy. He doesn't matter." The officer stood up, his jaw tightening. He had heard enough. "That's no excuse," he said, his voice growing more stern. "You don't treat people like that. Now step aside." The teenagers hesitated, clearly unsure how to react. But the officer's presence was commanding, and one by one they backed off, muttering to each other as they walked away. The officer turned back to the man on the ground, who was now sitting up but still looking weak and disoriented. "Hey, can you tell me your name?" the officer asked, his voice softening again. The man looked up at him, his eyes filled with confusion. I don't remember." The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, calling for medical assistance. He stayed with the man, speaking to him in a calm, reassuring voice as they waited. When the paramedics arrived, they quickly took over, assessing the man's condition and preparing to take him to the hospital. The officer watched as they carefully loaded him into the ambulance, feeling a sense of responsibility for the situation that had unfolded. As the ambulance drove away, the officer turned back to his patrol car, his mind racing. He had grown up in a world where people like the man on the ground were often ignored or dismissed. Homelessness, poverty, and suffering were things that people didn't want to think about. They were uncomfortable truths that people preferred to look away from. But the officer had learned over the past months that those uncomfortable truths were just as important as any law he enforced. People mattered, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from. He spent the rest of the day reflecting on the incident. The teenagers' actions had angered him, but it was the way they had dismissed the man's humanity that troubled him the most. He had seen this kind of behavior before, in his own actions and in others. It was easy to ignore people when they didn't fit into your world, when they didn't look or act like you, but he had learned that this kind of thinking was what led to injustice, to the kinds of mistakes he had made in the past. As the sun began to set, the officer found himself back at the general's office, waiting to speak with him. The general had asked to meet, and the officer wasn't sure what to expect. He had been working hard to change, to be better, but he knew that there was still a long way to go. This meeting felt important, like it would determine whether or not he was truly on the right path. The general greeted him with a firm handshake and a nod. "Take a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. The officer sat down, his nerves buzzing in the quiet room. The general studied him for a moment before speaking. "I've been hearing good things about you," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "Your work with the new training programs, your efforts to improve your approach to policing, it's not going unnoticed." The officer felt a small sense of pride, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he still had a long way to go. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. The general leaned forward, his expression serious. "But I've also been hearing about the incident in the park today. The situation with the homeless man." The officer's heart sank. He hadn't expected the general to know about it so soon. "I did what I had to do," the officer said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "The kids were harassing him and I couldn't just walk away." The general nodded slowly. "I understand. But you need to understand something. People like that man, people who are homeless, struggling, don't always get the help they need. It's easy to forget about them, to treat them like they don't matter. But as an officer, you have a responsibility to protect everyone, even those who are often overlooked. You have a duty to make sure people don't get lost in the cracks of society." The officer looked down, feeling the weight of the general's words. He had known this on some level, but hearing it from the general made it feel more real. He had been so focused on doing his job the right way that he had forgotten what it meant to truly serve. It wasn't just about following the law. It was about understanding the people you were serving, all people, even those who were invisible to others. The general leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "I'm proud of what you did today, but this is just the beginning. You need to keep pushing yourself, keep learning. The community needs officers who are willing to step up, not just when it's easy, but when it's difficult. They need officers who care about more than just their next call. They need officers who care about the people they're serving." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of resolve fill him. He had made mistakes in the past, but he was ready to move forward. He wasn't perfect and he knew he would stumble again, but he was determined to do better, to be better. As the meeting came to a close, the general stood up and extended his hand. "Keep up the good work," he said. "And remember, it's about the people. Always." The officer shook his hand, feeling a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was someone who understood the true meaning of service. And that, he realized, was something he could carry with him for the rest of his career. The days following his meeting with the general felt different. The officer had come to terms with the fact that his journey was far from over, but he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every day he worked harder to not only enforce the law, but to understand the people he was protecting. He was starting to see his role in a new light, one that was not just about punishing wrongdoers, but about being a protector for everyone, no matter their circumstances. As the weeks went by, the officer began to notice small changes in his interactions with the community. People who had once avoided him or looked at him with distrust now greeted him with a nod or a smile. The tension that had been there before seemed to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of respect. The officer didn't take these changes for granted. He knew they were the result of hard work and the slow process of rebuilding trust, but they were also a reminder that he was moving in the right direction. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, he received a call about a disturbance in a nearby neighborhood. The call didn't sound particularly urgent, but it was routine, and the officer knew that even the smallest situation could escalate quickly. He drove to the scene, his mind focused on the task at hand. As he pulled up, he noticed a group of people gathered around a small house. There was shouting coming from inside, and the officer could hear the sound of something being thrown against the walls. The officer got out of his car, his hand resting on his belt, and approached the group of people standing outside. They were a mix of adults and teenagers, all of them tense, watching the house with wary eyes. The officer felt a sense of unease as he noticed the signs of a domestic dispute, something he had seen far too many times during his years on the force. He approached one of the adults, a woman who was standing at the edge of the crowd.
"What's going on?"
he asked, keeping his voice calm. The woman glanced at him nervously before speaking. "It's inside, officer. We don't know what's happening, but there's yelling. It's getting out of control." The officer nodded and moved toward the door. He wasn't sure what he would find inside, but he knew that no matter what, he had to remain calm. He knocked firmly on the door, announcing his presence. After a few moments, the door swung open and a man stood there, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What's going on in there?" the officer asked, his tone steady. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, his gaze flickering to the room behind him. The officer could hear the sound of muffled voices, angry, upset voices. The man hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to let the officer inside. The officer's instincts told him that the situation was more serious than it seemed. "I need to come inside," the officer said, his voice firm. "I need to make sure everyone is okay." The man seemed to snap out of his daze, and without a word he stepped aside, allowing the officer to enter. The officer moved cautiously into the house, keeping his eyes peeled for any signs of violence. As he stepped into the living room, he saw a woman standing by the window, her face tear-streaked, her hands trembling. The officer took a moment to assess the situation. The woman looked terrified, and the man who had opened the door appeared to be unstable, his behavior erratic. "Is everyone okay here?" the officer asked, addressing both the man and the woman. The man's eyes flickered with anger. "She's crazy," he spat, his voice slurred. "She's the one causing all this." The officer's gaze shifted to the woman. She looked exhausted, her body tense as though she was on edge, ready to bolt at any moment.
"What's going on?"
the officer asked gently, his tone softening. The woman hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been drinking again. He's been getting violent. I don't know what to do anymore." The officer nodded, understanding the situation. Domestic violence wasn't something he had ever gotten used to, but over the years he had come to understand the complex dynamics involved. He knew that the woman felt trapped, afraid to speak out because of the man's threats and violent tendencies. He had seen this kind of thing happen time and time again. The hardest part was knowing when to intervene and how to do it without escalating the situation. "I'm going to call for backup," the officer said, his voice calm and reassuring. He stepped outside and spoke into his radio, requesting additional units. As he waited for them to arrive, he stayed close to the woman, making sure she felt safe and that the situation didn't escalate further. When backup arrived, the officers quickly took control of the scene. They spoke to both the man and the woman, gathering information, and eventually arrested the man for assault. The woman was taken to a safe place away from the house and offered support. As the officers handled the paperwork, the officer stood back, watching everything unfold. This was a moment where he could see the change he had been striving for. His training, his new perspective, it had all come together in that moment. He wasn't just enforcing the law, he was helping to protect someone who needed it. As the man was taken away in handcuffs, the officer turned to the woman. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "You don't have to go through this alone." She looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude but also sadness. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." The officer gave her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said, "and we're going to make sure you get the help you need." Later that evening, after everything had calmed down and the paperwork had been filed, the officer sat in his patrol car, reflecting on what had happened. The situation hadn't been easy, but he felt good about how it had turned out. He had done more than just respond to a call. He had been there for someone who needed help, who had been overlooked and treated poorly by others. It was moments like this that made the officer realize that his job was more than just a career. It was a calling. Over the next few weeks, the officer continued his work, responding to calls, patrolling the streets, and engaging with the community. He was no longer just an enforcer of the law. He was a part of the community. People started to trust him, to see him not just as someone who upheld the law, but as someone who cared about their well-being. It was a long journey, but the officer felt proud of how far he had come. He knew he would make mistakes in the future, but he also knew that every mistake was an opportunity to learn and grow.